Good morning. I'm Marge Stockton, and I will be your worship leader this morning. During the service, we recommend you have your Zoom screen set to speaker view. Common Ground is our celebration of worship for people of many paths who are gathering virtually to share in the responsible search for meaning and truth. Pathways is a warm and open community where all who come with open minds and kind hearts are welcome, regardless of ability, age, race, gender, gender identity, or sexual orientation. If you are visiting with us today, we welcome you to our service. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. To find out more about Pathways, email us at office@pathwaysuu.org. We hope that all who join us here today find this a safe place to worship. Our opening song this morning is hymn 348, Guide My Feet. This African-American spiritual, inspired by Psalm 119, is a lament to God for mercy. Guide My Feet directly points out the work different groups of people need to do. People of color to be sustained and keep resisting, and whites to do the hard work of dismantling white supremacy from within. As we remain muted, please feel free to join in or just listen. Guide My Feet.
Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet while I run this race. For I don't want to run this race in vain. Hold my hand while I run this race. Hold my hand while I run this race. Hold my hand while I run this race. For I don't want to run this race in vain. Stand by me while I run this race. Stand by me while I run this race. Stand by me while I run this race. For I don't want to run this race in vain.
Well, that ended suddenly. I don't know what happened. As we virtually light our chalice this morning, please join me in these words by Marian Wright Edelman. God, please help us remember that all the darkness in the world cannot snuff out the light of one little candle. Help us to keep lighting our little candles until a mighty torch of justice sweeps our nation and our world. I invite you to join me in a renewal of our sacred promises. Please read along with me. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve human need to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other. Our call to worship this morning is the lovely short poem by Langston Hughes called Dreams. Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird who cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field frozen with snow. Our worship song this morning, if it plays, is Keep On Moving Forward by Emma's Revolution.
Gonna keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna keep on moving proudly. Keep on moving proudly. Keep on moving proudly. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna keep on singing loudly. Keep on singing loudly. Keep on singing loudly. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna keep on loving boldly. Keep on loving boldly. Keep on loving boldly. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna reach across our borders. Reach across our borders. Reach across our borders. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna end the occupations. End the occupations. End the occupations. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna stop this war together. Stop this war together. Stop this war together. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Never turning back. Never turning back.
Our speaker this morning is former Pathways member Carrie Stewart. As the owner and principal of One World Consulting, Carrie has served various communities and organizations in their quest for greater understanding, inclusion, and appreciation of diverse individuals and groups. She brings nearly 3 decades of experience in equity, inclusion, and diversity through training, facilitation, coaching, dialogue convening, and leadership development. Additionally, Carrie is an advanced trained mediator and works in conflict transformation and community and family engagement to find common ground. As an intercultural communication consultant, she is a knowledge expert on navigating through cultures, and for the last 5 years has applied this to the global mobility industry, supporting relocating employees. A lifelong UU, Carrie has been a child, youth, member, and friend of 13 congregations in 6 districts. She served as a SWUC, Southwest UU congregations, SWUC, and Southern Region consultant specializing in anti-racism, anti-oppression, and multiculturalism, conflict transformation, leadership, compassionate communication, and healthy congregations. Additionally, she served on the Journey Toward Wholeness Transformation Committee of the UUA, UU Allies for Racial Equality Steering Committee, SWUC Board, and was a DBLE staff member for several years. She currently serves on the UUA Nominating Committee, the Racial Equity Task Force, and Adult Ministries Council of First Unitarian Church in Dallas. She holds a bachelor's degree in American Studies from Smith College and a master's in communication from Rutgers University. Carrie and her spouse, Fred Ditmars, who's also with us this morning, are empty nesters, having raised 2 third-generation UUs, now an artist and a medical school student in Colleyville, Texas, where they enjoy movies, theater, music, travel, and their last dog. Now we welcome Carrie to our virtual pulpit with Turning Toward Racial Justice. And I'm going to stop sharing so Carrie can come up.
Okay.
Welcome,
Thank you.
Carrie.
Thank you, Marge. And thank you for all the support these last few weeks, especially these last couple of days. Thank you, Mary, for the invitation to return to Pathways once again to speak. Our family's experience at Pathways was formative in our UU faith as a family, and we carry great memories of the people and particularly the worship from Pathways. So I'm very glad to see a vibrant congregation here this morning. Thanks to all of you for coming today. And I've taken on as part of my personal mission, engaging as many Unitarian Universalists, particularly those who identify as white, in the work of racial justice and equity as I can. So it's good to be with you here today. Finally, thanks to my spouse, as Marge mentioned, Fred Ditmars, a former president of Pathways, for accompanying me here today. He's been along on this journey with me for nearly 30 years now, as he reminded me just yesterday. The 8 minutes and 46 seconds phone recording in May that police officer Derek Chauvin held his knee on the handcuffed George Floyd's neck, including 2 minutes past his death, was a video execution scene around the world. In the context of an economic shutdown with an unemployment rate of over 13% during a global pandemic that at that time had taken 100,000 lives, the movement for Black Lives, and a US administration that emboldened white nationalist movements resulted in an uprising over police brutality against Black people we have never seen in history. The numbers of white people who demonstrated in the streets over the past summer, the corporations producing commercials with calls for racial equity, and the sports teams who continue to shun Colin Kaepernick are all now publicly stating that Black Lives Matter. I very much appreciate the statement on Pathways website by the Board of Trustees also calling for police brutality to end. We saw protests, demonstrations, rallies, and vigils all across the country and all across the globe. I watched as the cities where I've lived, Detroit, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, Austin, here in Dallas and Fort Worth, and every city in between, including my hometown of Ridgewood, New Jersey, and my current city of Colleyville, rise up with calls for the violence and the disparate treatment to stop. Racial justice is now a top policy priority for the incoming Biden administration, excuse me, and for our own Texas UU Justice Ministry in Austin. I've been involved in racial justice movements since I was 5, when I asked why my grandfather and uncle were using the ugly N-word. And the tide that has turned is like a great awakening of the dominant culture that has at best been complicit in racism and perpetuating white supremacy, and at worst propagating horribly violent racial oppression. As a white person living in the United States, I'm always conscious of a couple of things. The enormity of what we commonly refer to as the slave trade, but which included the kidnapping and enslavement of 20 million African people into forced free labor. As a consequence, the US was built by and on the backs of Black people. And although, because in order to rationalize enslaving other humans requires dehumanizing them, creating a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority based on specious racial categories, Black people and other marginalized groups, including indigenous peoples who've suffered genocide at the hands of Europeans, white Americans, and the US government, have fought with their bodies, hearts, and minds for liberation for us all from this deadly virus, and to bring this country closer to its ideals stated in our founding documents. Those ideals have a lot in common with our proclaimed religious values. Unitarians and Universalists have a long history of working for racial justice, for we are, I believe, called to the work of racial justice and equity as a matter of faith. Our Unitarian Universalist Association principles and purposes state that we affirm and promote first, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Second, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And sixth, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And it's likely we'll soon have an 8th principle, affirming a commitment to anti-racism. Our UU sources of our living tradition derive from the words and deeds of prophetic women and men, which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil and justice, with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. James Luther Adams, a preeminent 20th century theologian, wrote in the 5 Smooth Stones of Liberal Religion that 2 of these stones are that we freely choose to enter into relationship with one another, and that we have a moral obligation to work toward establishing a just and loving community. So we UUs very much have a spiritual grounding to do this work. This is part of why so many communities and groups look to us to participate and show up, often in our yellow shirts and stoles. For Unitarian Universalists historically, and I'm borrowing heavily from the resources on the UUA webpage, including Tapestry of Faith, the UU World, and The Universe is Long by Leslie Takahashi and others. The work of racial justice includes many people whose stories we can get to know through these resources. Our history is not always pleasant to read, and our people did not always land on the right side of history. In truth, the road is littered with missteps and wrong turns, and we are certainly still on the journey. Elhanan Winchester, an American Universalist, spoke out against slavery in Virginia and published an anti-slavery address in 1787 in England. However, the first denominational action on anti-slavery came in 1790 when the Universalist Convention in Philadelphia adopted an anti-slavery resolution by the well-regarded Universalist Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Some of the country's leading abolitionists were women and men who identified as Unitarian or Universalist. John Quincy Adams, a Unitarian, stood up against the agreement that kept Congress from debating slavery. Prominent abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison acted for immediate cessation of slavery, And the father of American Unitarianism, William Ellery Channing, became an ardent abolitionist, but only after seeing the success of Britain's abolition of slavery in the West Indies. The Transcendental movement, with its emphasis on self-culture and moral growth that required human freedom, added energy to the anti-slavery movement. In 1841, Theodore Parker preached powerfully, calling slavery the great national sin, and ably linking his theology with his politics. In the 1840s, collective anti-slavery action intensified in both denominations. Also in 1841, the Universalists held their first anti-slavery convention in Lynn, Massachusetts, followed by annual conferences that declared slavery inconsistent with Universalism. In 1845, when 173 Unitarian ministers signed a protest against American slavery, they mentioned the foundational documents of the country, saying, "To constantly profess one thing and constantly to practice another must destroy the sinews of national virtue." Because of the hierarchy of racial superiority and inferiority that was established along with the founding of the US, in order for colonial Europeans to achieve economic and social power in a conquered land, the systems and structures that were formed baked a white supremacy hierarchy into our society. For anyone who studied systems theory in biology, in families, in organizations, we know that systems survive because they are strong. The pull of homeostasis is like gravity. So when a change or shock to the system happens that rearranges the order of things, the system wants to snap right back. What we experience in our society in terms of racial justice is a backlash of racism. The backlash to abolition of slavery was segregation and Jim Crow, which lasted through the 20th century until the modern civil rights movement. It's reported that hundreds of brand new, after the merger, Unitarian Universalists marched on Washington supporting Dr. Martin Luther King. About 500 Unitarian Universalists, including nearly 1/5 of all Unitarian Universalist ministers, plus lay people like Viola Liuzzo, went to Selma and Montgomery to participate in the civil rights campaign. Only one Unitarian Universalist, Reverend Richard D. Leonard, joined the 300-person march all the way from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery. Viola Liuzzo was murdered by the KKK when she was transporting people from Selma to Montgomery, and the Reverend James Reeb died from injuries after he, Reverend Orloff Miller, and Reverend Clark Olson were beaten, leaving a local Selma cafe. Although the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts were passed, the next backlash was a law and order government ushered in by Richard Nixon and the Southern Strategy, which flipped Southern Democrats over to Republicans by inciting racial fears. And it was then elevated by Ronald Reagan through the war on drugs, resulting in what attorney and author Michelle Alexander has coined the new Jim Crow. So there was continued work to be done. And UUs have been doing this work consistently, if sometimes imperfectly, ever since. We do keep showing up. Then Barack Obama was elected the first Black president of the US, and we're now experiencing that backlash. Police brutality, the murder of Trayvon Martin, the election of Donald Trump, and all of the misery this administration brings to the marginalized and vulnerable the most. So even though there's intensified pressure on the system to change, there's still work to do in this turning to achieve racial justice and equity and end white supremacy culture. How is that work happening now, and where can you participate? UU churches and congregations have been in the front lines of the current protests all summer in Louisville, Kenosha, Wisconsin, Lexington, Massachusetts, and Portland, Oregon. At the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly in June, the delegates passed a resolution calling for the defunding of the police in light of the continuation of widespread police brutality. Marge, if you want to put up that first slide. At the First Unitarian Church of Dallas, we've been members since 2012, we formed a racial equity task force in May of 2018 with the mission to help transform our church culture from one steeped in the white supremacy system to one that is actively engaged in justice making and liberation. Oh, is that the first one? What's the next one? Oh, how about the next one? I think maybe they got out of order. There it is. Okay, that's the one I'm looking for. So the Racial Equity Task Force at First Unitarian Church of Dallas was formed in May of 2018 with the mission to help transform our church culture from one steeped in white supremacy system to one that is actively engaged in justice making and liberation. Our 10 members developed this racial equity pledge that you see on the screen, and over 700 members of the church have signed it to date. I think the next slide. Is there another one? We've held 6 rounds of 3-session small discussion groups with 2 facilitators. Okay, you can leave it there. 6 rounds of 3-session small group discussions with 2 facilitators each and 8 participants, and over 100 members have participated so far. And recently we've led a book study of Just Mercy by Equal Justice Initiative's founder, Brian Stevenson, a racial justice workshop with UU racial justice organizer, Chris Crass, and a concert with UU Reggie Harris with songs of joy in the struggle, all online. I understand that Pathways is also forming a group to address racism, and we'd be happy to share. Here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, a number of groups and coalitions organized protests and public dialogues this past summer. They include longstanding organization Mothers Against Police Brutality, which Colette Flanagan founded after her son, 28-year-old Clinton Allen, was shot to death by a Dallas police officer in March 2013. Clinton was unarmed. He was shot once in the arm, 5 times in the chest, and once in the back. Flanagan's experiences in the aftermath of this official homicide, the indifference of Dallas City Hall, the lack of any assistance to the surviving family, the vilification of her son in the media, and finally the impunity enjoyed by the killer turned her grief into anger and then into action. Other groups are In Solidarity, Not My Son, We Take the Streets. They all help organize and support protests in North Texas. The DFW Activist Network brings together local organizers. After the murder of George Floyd, In Defense of Black Lives, Dallas Coalition formed that includes the BYP 100 Dallas, the local chapter of a national organization of Black young adults, Mothers Against Police Brutality, the House of Rebirth, a Dallas housing initiative and community safe space for Black trans women, the Afia Center, which serves Black women's reproductive needs and works for reproductive justice, the Democrats of Socialists of North America, North Texas, excuse me, the Palestine Action Committee of Texas, Free Them All Dallas, which raises awareness of the health crisis in jails and works to decarcerate Dallas, the North Texas Dream Team, which was created to advance the dreams and goals of Dreamers students, DSA North Texas Afro-Socialist and Socialists of Color Caucus, and the Dallas Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. The next slide, please. The coalition published a list of demands entitled Defund the Dallas Police Department and Invest in the Larger Dallas Community. We demand investments in the education, health, and safety of Black people instead of investments in the criminalizing, caging, and harming of Black people. We want divestment from militarizing the police and surveillance. As the city responds to projected COVID-19 shortfalls, it's necessary to cut from DPD's budget to support the communities. It requires a reduction in the size of the police force and removal of military-grade weapons and tactical gear that has been funded by the war on drugs. The coalition demands that a city and a country where those most impacted in their communities control the laws, institutions, and policies that are meant to serve, from school budgets to local budgets to economies, police departments, and land, while recognizing that the rights and histories of our Indigenous family must also be respected. Next slide. They also demand an immediate depopulation of Dallas County jails, prisons, immigrant detention centers, and juvenile facilities. We must get the people out of cages and ensure that they have what they need to be healthy and free through this pandemic and beyond. And finally, the demand is to end a war against Black people. We demand that DPD and all law enforcement agencies immediately cease enacting violence on community members. That we demand an end to the criminalization, incarceration, and killing of our people. That's it for the slides. And over in Fort Worth, organizations like DNA Works educates about local racial justice violence. They're currently doing driving and cycling tours of lynching spots in Fort Worth. Emancipate Fort Worth advocates for just and inclusive policies in city government. United Fort Worth and Enough is Enough organized protests and demonstrations. And there are deconfederate movements in Dallas, McKinney, Denton, Gainesville, and Waxahachie to remove Confederate statues, and in Dallas to rename public schools named for Confederate leaders. Showing Up for Racial Justice, for which I serve as the Dallas Fort Worth chapter director, and which is hosted by the First Unitarian Church of Dallas, was created after the election of President Obama, when white anti-racists saw the backlash coming. It has as its mission engaging white people in a multiracial movement for racial justice. You can look and search for our Facebook page and ask to join our Facebook group. Half of the members are UUs. And right here in Mid-Cities is the Anti-Racism Coalition for Black Lives in Keller and the South Lake Anti-Racism Coalition. Of course, with the coronavirus pandemic and shutdown, it's harder to connect with these efforts. But there's a lot happening online, and you can always donate to organizations working to change policy, as well as those support marginalized communities. And there are pages and pages and collections of reading lists, movies, videos, podcasts, webinars, all kinds of resources online. And all you have to do is use Google to find those to help increase your own education and awareness. Ibram Kendi, in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, advocates for working for policy change that will alleviate oppression of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Try to notice the inequities in the organizations you're involved in. Talk to the people who are affected. Advocate for equitable policies. Ashley Henderson, the co-executive director of the famed Highlander Research and Education Center outside Knoxville, Tennessee, which was founded by white anti-racists almost 90 years ago and trained Martin Luther King, said in a recent Zoom all-chapter call meeting of Surge National, she said that to end white supremacy, focus on anti-Blackness. Janice Gassam Asare writes that anti-Blackness infiltrates every system and structure in America. Just look at the results and disparities in health outcomes, educational attainment, and wealth accumulation. Work to disrupt these systems, advocate for policy changes, support Black-owned businesses and creatives, use your power and your privilege to push for change. Then there will be a true turning towards racial justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. It's clear we have a lot of work to do. It's very challenging, and I love hearing the history behind that you shared with us this morning. Our closing song for today is Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Round by The Roots.
Can't let them turn me around, Lord. Turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I just keep on walking, oh, I keep on because I'm marching on the freedom land. Ain't gonna let no jailhouse, ain't let it turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let no jailhouse turn me around. You know I keep on, I just keep on because I'm marching on the freedom land. I can't let segregation turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let segregation turn me around. I just keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on the freedom land. Ain't gonna let no dogs off, can't let it turn me around, Lord, turn me around. Ain't gonna let no dogs off. Well, I just keep on, you know I keep on, because I'm marching on the freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody, can't let them turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody, well, I just keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on the freedom land.
Now, as we extinguish our virtual chalice flame, please read with me these words. In this small flame dwell the beacon light of lanterns guiding travelers home, the warmth of hearth fires tended through the generations, the transforming energy of furnaces, and the power and life of our sun. May these blessings, warmth and light and life-giving energy be kindled in each of us. We hope that each of you on your individual path through the joys and questions of life found some common ground with your fellow travelers here this morning. Our closing words today are by Frederick E. Gillis. May the love which overcomes all differences, which heals all wounds, which put flight to all fears, which reconciles all who are separated, be in us and among us, now and always. Blessed be. Go in peace.
Amen.
Thank you again, Carrie. And if you and Fred have time to stick around, we will take off the slides and everyone can visit for a while. Unmute yourselves, go to Big View, and we'll visit for a while. Our small groups begin at 11:30.